Well, here we are with another 20 short stories from some of my archives. So I'm just going to give you guys a little fun here, and I'm going to jump right into this thing and see what we can do. This right here was the Service Bay Diagnostic System. Came out in about 1990, I guess it was. And that thing was pretty doggone amazing in what it would do. I haven't seen many machines that they made, even at the dealer level, that would do the cool things that this machine would do. And it was my best friend for about 9 years, basically. And it really was pretty strong even on OBD2 stuff, because of the fact that it would reflash and do that kind of thing. And it was connected directly to the Ford network, so it could, and there were special service messages that would come in so that I could actually print those out in the printer that was in this thing and put them on the wall over there. And I got a little funny story about that. Well, I found out I could boot this thing up on a floppy disk in such a way to where I could actually type text that would print out on the printer, and I could make it look just like a special service message. And so one time, you know, those guys were used to seeing those special service messages I would put under the time clock, and they I went up there one day, and I had been horsing around with the special service, and I would put special services messages would come out in this, you know, roll of paper, and I would put these stories in here that I fabricated, and I would say California police units may have ammunition problems with their fender-mounted rotary cannons, and there was a recall number I put on there for that, and it was mixed right in with a bunch of other legitimate Ford special service messages. And some of these rednecks, of course I'm a redneck too, would come up there and read that. Says, doggone, they're putting guns on them now. But anyhow, there was another one I did, and the service manager's name was Mark Moore, and I would put him, I did a special service messages, and it said, congratulations to Mark Moore for record-breaking sales in the service department at the Ford place I worked at. And he will get a free, all expense paid trip to the Bahamas, you know, because of that. And so I printed that and wove it into a bunch of special service messages, and he went and jerked that thing off the wall and went and showed it to everybody in the dealership, you know. I told the dealer principal what I had done, and he said he's going to shoot you when he finds out. Well, the dumb thing about it is, he's actually got he actually won one of those things, and it was just absolutely crazy that he won one about 2 weeks for about that same thing right after I put this bogus special service message. I beat all I ever saw. And this was a picture of me from back then. That was in 1998, I guess, and I had gone down to Covington, Louisiana to what I was told was going to be a 2-day school. And the 2-day school that I went for, I took a pair of street clothes, spent the night, changed into my street clothes. I changed out of this uniform into my street clothes, and it was an electrical class. We had bought the Jeep franchise back in 1988, and eventually Daimler Chrysler wound up for a while with the Jeep franchise. And so when we got a new franchise or whatever, I was expected to go to the basic electrical school for whoever it was. And so I went to the basic electrical school, and every time I've ever gone to any electrical school, and I've been to a lot of them with Mazda and Volkswagen and a bunch of other outfits, you know, Ford obviously, and then Jeep, but I learned something every time. I mean, you know, you think you know all there is to know about something, and really you don't. And so I learned a lot of cool stuff. But that particular day, I was sitting there in class. I figured, okay, this is going to be a 2-day class, and then I will go on back home. And so what happened was they told us we were going to be in class for 4.5 days, and they only gave me enough money to get, you know, by for 2 days. And so and I told them, I said, you know, my wife is not going to understand this, but anyway, I had to call on my cell phone because I had a cell phone by that time. and the service manager gave him a credit card at the hotel so I could, you know, get my meals and all that kind of stuff. But the crazy stuff that came out of that school was, I learned some stuff in that school, but there were some other things that I thought were crazy, like the instructor. He was a guy that had never, I don't think he'd ever fixed a car, he just got hired to be an instructor. And he was saying at one point that resistance doesn't cause heat, which didn't make any sense at all. And there were 12 of us in the classroom, and I looked around at these other guys, and they were all rolling their eyes. And I said, why are you saying that? You know, why are you saying resistance doesn't cause? Why do they make resistors out of ceramic? Because ceramic handles heat. Anyway, I finally got him to back off of that, because that's the craziest thing. I don't know where he came up with that. But every now and then you'll hear somebody say something, like I was talking about the other day when somebody said, anytime you take the thermostat out of an engine, it will overheat, which is, anybody that's ever worked on cars knows better than that. And every now and then you wonder, where in the world did they get this information, and how did they get convinced that it was true when it's obviously a fallacy, you know? This was a Dodge, late 90s Dodge. We actually, it was a sledged up thing, you know, like the Dodges like to do, and ordered the timing chain for it. This timing chain kit for this engine from Advanced Auto Parts was like $480 just for the kit. And I was like blown away from, you know, about how much the timing chain kit cost for one of these. And we put the timing chain kit in that one. And I told the guy, I said, we're going to put the timing chain in there, we're going to clean the pan, we're going to get all the sludge out of it that we possibly can, but you may still have issues because of the low oil pressure, because it tried to clog the screen. And he went ahead and paid us for all of that. And his oil pressure was still a little bit low, but he could drive the truck, and he was happy, you know, because we were a school, we weren't charging him a lot of labor or anything. But my goodness, furthermore, the first timing chain kit that they sent us was not the right one. When you get one of these timing chain kits out of the box, you better look at those cam, those little reluctor wheels on the cams, you know, for the hall sensors, for the cam sensors, because sometimes people will either swap out an engine, or they'll put the wrong kit on there, and it'll have the wrong, you know, configuration on those vanes, on those little Hall effect cups, and that's a disaster, because then the thing won't start, and you got to start all over. Well, I picked this one out of the box and compared them. It's always a good idea to compare stuff whenever you're looking at the new parts to make sure. One of my students one time pulled a set of head gaskets out that he was going to put on a 3-liter or a 3.8, I can't remember what it was. And these things came from Felpro, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And he was noticing that the, you know, the little choke down holes where the coolant flows into the heads is supposed to make the coolant flow slower, so it'll have more time to pick up heat. If you make those holes the same size, it's going to go through there too fast, you know, and that will, you know, cause an overheating issue. And so I had a very sharp student that compared the gaskets and said, these gaskets look a little different. And so I contacted the parts store, and he contacted Felpro, and Felpro says, oh crap, I don't know how that happened, don't use those gaskets. And they sent us some more that were the right ones. But you see, somebody that wasn't paying attention could have popped those gaskets on there. Some of you guys, I guarantee you, have got stories like that, where you got parts you thought were the right parts, and when you put them on there, it turned out that the way they were manufactured actually caused a big problem. All right, this was a funny little thing about somebody. I picked it up, I grabbed this off Facebook or somewhere. Somebody said, I changed my timing belt and now it still won't start. And look at, they put the teeth going to the outside. But there is a couple of other little things I want to say about timing belts. You know, you got square cut timing belts, and you've got round cut timing belts. And so the thing about the round ones is those right there, if you tighten the round ones up too tight, you'll wind up with a situation where there's noise. You'll basically have a woo woo noise when you rev it up, and that will happen if one of these round tooth timing belts is too tight. The timing belt does not need to be as tight as a belt that's pulling accessories or something, because it's got these teeth on it. Now these square tooth timing belts aren't quite so bad to do that. Some of the Escorts that we had would have a timing belt like that, and we had a run with some of the Escorts in the 80s that they had a distributor on them, and the distributor was driven by the camshaft. It was on the opposite end of the camshaft from the, you know, from the timing belt sprocket and all that. And you would sit here and watch one of these escorts, and it would have a little funky misfire, boo poo poo, and you'd actually see the tack needle bounce like that. This wasn't like a spark plug thing or something. I knew there was something going on with the ignition system, and it wasn't that complicated, because that was a peculiar one there. Those had a TFI module, but instead of having a Hall effect, they had a regular stator in there, like an old-fashioned Duraspark system did. That was just the strangest one of those. But one way or another, I noticed that you could put a distributor in there, and for a little while it would stop doing that, but then would start doing it again. And what I eventually discovered was if this timing belt got a little bit loose, and a little bit too loose just from stretching and all, and it didn't have a spring-loaded tensioner on those the way they were set up. I mean, well, kind of it did, but you were supposed to tighten it so that it wouldn't be spring-loaded, but there was a spring that was supposed to tension it, and then you were supposed to tighten the, you know, anybody that's worked on an escort knows what I'm talking about. Anyway, all I had to do to fix that boom, boom, boom skip on those things was tighten that timing belt just a little bit. That's all it took to take care of it. Took me a couple of times to figure that out, though. But this is an interesting little Mazda vehicle that the lady came in there and she drove into some sort of a low concrete post and bent these heat exchangers like that right there. And believe it or not, neither the AC condenser or the radiator leaked any coolant or refrigerant at all. They bent that badly without a single leak. Of course, we still had to, you know, we went ahead and replaced those, as I remember, and we also had to replace a part of the part of the housing. It was a plastic housing that these mounted in. It was just shattered, so we had to replace all that. And she had just done that. That guy didn't even file an insurance claim. You know, he just had us take care of it at the school because he worked for the college. Now this right here is from a Ford Fusion. You know, it's got those two ball joints on the outside on the bottom, and you know, with these control arms, and that's the inside of one of them. And we were hearing this pop clunk noise up in the front whenever you would make certain maneuvers, and that darn thing right there, the rubber was shot. But the crazy thing about this is on that Fusion, this is up in there where you can't see it. So you can't just do a quick inspection of these with your flashlight and say, yeah, that's what it is. You got to take this stupid thing out of there. And when we took it out of there and saw that, we actually used it, you know, our chassis ears, I remember, and we found out that the popping was coming from the place where this was going through. Now occasionally when you have something like this, you can actually, it depends on how the failure is happening, you can really tighten the bolt that's going through there an awful lot. If it's squeaking when it's going over bumps and stuff, and you can stop it from doing that a lot of the time. And I'm talking about you got to tighten it to the point where you feel like you're about to bust the head off the thing. Of course, those bolts are super, you know, they're like 10.9 if I mean metric and all. But one way or another, whenever one's got the worn out rubber, just tightening that bolt's not going to do away with the noise. And these weren't squeaking, they were popping and clunking because that rubber had given way and it was letting that happen like that. Anyway, I took that picture just to show you guys about that. All right. Make sure that you look up torque specs on caliper bracket bolts. Some people that, you know, brake work is whenever you're just blindly throwing brake pads on one, and every one of us has done that probably in our driveway. But you need to make sure that you tighten those caliper bracket bolts if you had to take them out of there for whatever reason. The caliper bracket bolts have got a surprisingly high torque spec on them, and it's a really good idea to make sure you put your good torque wrench on there and you torque them to what they call for. I've seen some vehicles, seems to me like I ran into an 08 Nissan, and the torque spec was more than the lug nuts, which was totally amazing. But usually the torque spec is close to the same as the lug nuts, but you need to look it up. And I was teaching my guys to make sure you torque those. That did a couple of things. It made sure they were tightening them like they were supposed to, and it also made sure they didn't forget to tighten them. Because I have had students that I have gone behind them and found out that they barely tightened those caliper bracket bolts because they didn't think it was a significant issue. And but you know, if you're teaching anybody, it's always a really good idea to go behind them, and particularly on brake work, even though it's sort of like a mindless job, you know, to put brakes on because everybody has done so much of it. you just get a little too comfortable with it. And you know, this shop foreman of mine said he was learning to work on aircraft back in when he was in the late 50s, when he was in the Air Force, and you can get really, really comfortable in a dangerous environment. This is slightly off subject, but he says if you get too comfortable around the spinning propellers on those aircraft, he said one of the guys walked into one of those propellers because he just got too comfortable around them. You know, if you're in and amongst a bunch of spinning propellers and you hadn't been there before, you're going to be all up on edge. But that's also like somebody that gets so comfortable jumping out of airplanes that they forget to put on their parachute. That has happened before to a photographer I heard about. He jumped out and he had all of his camera equipment, but realized after he jumped out that he had forgotten to strap on his parachute. And that's not a joke, that really happened. I remember actually seeing the tape of when he realized that he didn't have his parachute on. Now this thing right here was a 2006 Sonata, Hyundai Sonata, that they actually gave it to us at the plant up there in Alabama. I went up there and they gave like 17 of these out to schools around the state. And whenever they gave me this car here, I brought it back and I used it for a trainer. It's still over there at the school. But one day there were some guys that came walking out of the other shop that we had, and they walked past this car. They were coming to the classroom and they said, that back windshield looks really strange. It's got a sort of an opaque look to it. And I don't know what the deal is on that. And so they said it wasn't broken when they came out of the thing, but it was really hot that day. And this was probably back in 2012. So whenever we walked out there after lunch, this back glass had shattered because of the heat. Now I will tell you that in this part of the country, back in the 1960s and early 70s, General Motors cars were shattering their glass like that in the heat. There was a rash of that down here in the deep south, you know, because it can get pretty hot down here. Although strangely enough, this summer and last summer in this part of the country, and last summer in my area, we didn't see temperatures over about 95. And right now, here we are in the middle of July, or just past the middle of July, and we haven't seen temperatures past about 91 or 92 degrees. But up in the Pacific Northwest, you know, they got record-breaking temperatures. And so you never know what weather's going to do anyway. Back in the 70s, they were telling us we were all going to freeze to death. You know, Leonard Nimoy even made a video about that back in the 70s with all this scientific data that said there was an ice age coming and everybody was going to freeze. But the world does a lot better when it's warmer than it does when it's colder, because you can grow more food, you know. They used to grow grapes in England a long time ago. Anyway, I don't know how I got off on that. But Chevrolet, I believe, put something called astroventilation on their cars later on. I don't know if that was because of these windshields or whatever. Somebody else might be more knowledgeable on astroventilation than me. But that was something GM came out with in the late 60s and early 70s, astroventilation. Now, coil pack ignition, most people have, you know, learned about coil pack ignition, although more and more and more cars now, almost every car out there has got coil on plug. But these right here were fired by the same coil pack, but you might notice the electrodes didn't wear the same. I've seen that on Crown Victorias and Explorers and a lot of other ones. And it depends on which direction the spark is jumping. If the spark is jumping down, it'll wear one electrode more than the other. The opposite electrode will wear if it's jumping the other way. And I always enjoy laying those out there and showing it to people that I was training, that whenever you've got a little high mileage on, and this is coil pack, not coil on plug, because these right here, you know, because of their companion plugs are being fired by the same coil tower, the spark is going the opposite direction on one than it is the other. All right, now look at this one right here. Here we've got these dusty red deposits that you see on these spark plugs. The first time I ever saw these, and I mentioned it the other day, and well, 6 weeks ago or something, my brother had a 71 Thunderbird, and it started running really crappy, and he was using an octane booster. And the more octane booster, the more tanks he ran that octane booster through, the more of this stuff that got on the plugs than they actually got where they were misfiring and cutting up and popping. And I've seen this on vehicles more recently. People pour that octane booster in there thinking they're doing themselves a lot of good. And I'm not saying all octane booster does this, but I have seen octane booster do this on more than one vehicle. And these, if I'm not mistaken, came out of a Mustang that we were working on that had a strange surge that would actually go away when you unplug the EGR, but it wasn't an EGR surge. It was because of these plugs being like they were, and side firing and all that kind of stuff. This is a funny little meme that I created. I took a picture of the hubcap on one of the cars. Even back in the early 70s, Ford had fancy hubcaps they would put on their truck, and it looked like you were looking at lug nuts and fancy wheels, but you pop this cap off and you see a plain old stamped steel wheel. And somebody that really doesn't know as much as you think they should will put a socket on here. I don't know. I mean, and they'll just try to screw that out, and then they bust this thing off of here, and then you've got a dumb looking hubcap. I had seen that as far back as 72 on Ford trucks that were nearly brand new back then, because it messed up in there. They messed up the hubcap thinking they were going to take the wheels off by taking these, screwing these out of there. Now, if you get your fuel pump, it's always a good idea to look at your fuel pump, make sure that it's indexed the same way. Here was one we got for, I think it was a Chevy pickup, and you notice how this one here is turned a different direction than that one. We actually ran into a situation on that one vehicle where whenever they put the fuel cylinder in the tank, the float was being held up so that it looked like the lady always had a lot of fuel. And I don't remember if it was because it was the wrong pump or because of the way they put it in there. But one way or another, she ran out of gas, and she called me, and she wasn't far from where we were. And I went over there, and whenever I used my little amp meter to bypass the fuel pump relay, I noticed it was only pulling 1.5 amps, and that meant she was out of gas, even though her gas gauge read 3/4 of a tank. And it was our fault because the gas gauge was, being the float arm was being held up, so it was always on 3/4 of a tank. And she was goofy enough to say, "My goodness, I'm getting really good gas mileage." And she even told me she was thinking that because she wondered how she drove, all the miles she drove, and it was still on 3/4 of a tank. But she was just believing what she was seeing because it sounded like something she wanted to believe. I took this picture at the dealership one day. This Roadrunner Superbird. I thought that's a really valuable car in some circles. But when I happened to look out there by the used car area, and somebody had parked that thing out there, and I said, "I want to take me a picture of that," And so I captured an image of that Superbird. I thought you guys might enjoy looking at that thing. Those are kind of rare and hard to come by now. This is how I fixed a broken gear shifter on a semi. I talked about this one time, but I don't think I ever showed you any kind of illustration on it or not. The gear shifter originally looked like this, and they put some kind of it was on a white road boss, and they put some kind of a funky big Hurst big truck shifter on it or something. Some of them younger truck drivers did, and it broke the stud off of the thing. And of course, I was like 22 years old, and these older men says, "You're going to have to replace that shifter." And I said, "I think I can probably get this thing back on the road in about 30 minutes. If I take this and I file it flat and I center punch it and I drill down in there and then I tap it and then I put a 5/8 coarse threaded." I actually built a stud, by threading a bolt, put it down in there and put Loctite on it, and then they wound up looking like this. And them guys were telling me what was crazy about it was I hooked my leg over that gear shifter, and I got a big 1/2-inch drill when I started out with a pilot hole and with the smaller drill. But then I got this big 1/2-inch drill, and I held that thing up there. If that drill had come off, I'd probably drilled a hole in my leg. But anyway, I was going to prove them knotheads wrong because they told me it couldn't be done, So I drilled down in that gear shifter, and I tapped that thing just as pretty and straight you'd have thought it was done on a turret. On a drill press or something. But that truck was back on the road in about less than 30 minutes. Instead of having to wait for parts and order a shifter, all that kind of hogwash, I was able to do it right there. They were telling me, "You're still going to have to take the shifter out. There's no way you're going to be able to do that in the truck." Well, when I was 22, you tell me I can't do something, I'm going to prove you I can. We had a forklift, an old CY60 Clark, if I remember the number right, and the power steering pump was built on the back of the generator that charged the battery. This was an old forklift. And the seals kept going out in that power steering pump and flooding the generator, and then the generator quit putting out. and we would, replace the seals, and then we'd send a generator to get it all, cleaned out and rebuilt by the people at the place where we had all our starters and alternators and generators done. And we got all that taken care of, and it would, about a couple of months later, we'd do it again, and we were putting the seal in there nice and straight, and there wasn't anything wrong with the shaft. But I told my supervisor, I says, we need to put an alternator on this thing and a regular Delco voltage regulator, the remotely mounted one. And I says, because this is ridiculous. And we can get this battery, and you can't, there's no way you can do that. And well, there was a place right up there on the top of that Continental flathead engine where there was a perfect place for an alternator. And I built the brackets and got a circle burner and put on the torch, and even built the curved slot bracket, for tightening the belt and all. And I did that in about 2 or 3 hours, and I wired it all up and everything, and proved him wrong. But anyway, I was working at the same place. I was at an offshore service company. This one right here is what's wrong with this picture. Now, sometimes on these aluminum oil pans, when we would have one that would, the threads start to fail on these aluminum oil pans when they get a lot of miles on them, if a lot of people have changed the oil and have slightly over torqued the plug. And what I decided that I was going to do, and I've done this a few times, it's worked pretty well, but you got to be careful and really watch what you're doing, is I would take one of those kits that you put a bushing in there for a spark plug, and because usually these are 1 1/4, like 1 1/2 thread pitch, and so I'd get that 14 millimeter spark plug fixing thing, and I would tap that out with that tap, and then I would put one of those bushings in there, and then make sure it had the same the same threads as a spark plug. On some of them, in extreme cases, I've gone out to 18 millimeter, which is what I did on this one here. But the end of that thing is you actually are putting a steel bushing in there, but you got to do a really good job or you'll make a problem for yourself. If you tap the threads into the pan too far, then this thing won't stay. And you need to stop tapping so that whenever you screw that bushing in there, it's just shy of flush, but it can't keep screwing in there either. And so then you got to stake it with that tool, and then you can get a oil drain plug that's got the thread pitch that matches. It's just like a spark plug, and you screw it in there and torque it, and then you put a bushing in there. I've done that a few times, and it works pretty well. And so, but like I said, if you don't do it right, you'll make trouble for yourself, because people will screw it out, and then the dadgum. It's difficult to put Loctite in there because there's oil in them threads and everything, but if you clean them out good enough, you can usually get some Loctite in there and screw that bushing in there and then stake it and it'll stay. But that takes some skill. That's just something, do this at your own risk. I'm not going to take responsibility if you screw something up. But I fixed a bunch of them like this. But you got to be somebody that likes to fix stuff, basically on that. This is one of the most ignored warnings in history on a tool. Anybody that's ever bought a Snap-on screwdriver has seen this warning on the side of the screwdriver. Snap-on always has some crazy ideas about their tools. Snap-on, the old Snap-on guy, he would say, well, you need to break your bolt loose with a breaker bar and then put your little Snap-on ratchet on it and screw it out of there. But they said you're not supposed to use a Snap-on ratchet. That's what they used to say. I don't know what they're saying now. You're not supposed to put a Snap-on ratchet on a bolt, break it loose, because the teeth in the ratchet aren't designed for that kind of pressure. But I don't know how many times that I've had to have those ratchets rebuilt, because I always thought they didn't have that many teeth. They weren't very strong. They were kind of crummy, and they cost a pretty good bit. Of course, I bought a Snap-on ratchet with 2 spark plug sockets from the Snap-on tool truck in 1977 for $27. And it was a long-handled, Snap-on ratchet. It was just for doing plugs, and it came with two straight plug sockets and all that. That ratchet is still somewhere over at my dad's shop, because I think I gave it to him. But this was computer command control. You might remember there's a solenoid in the carburetor that goes up and down 10 times a second, and the duty cycle, you would basically take your dwell meter and hook it up, and you're not looking at the distributor dwell, you're basically looking at the, you're supposed to run from I can't remember the numbers, 15 to 35% dwell if everything's working like it's supposed to. It's supposed to be switching back and forth. That's basically reflecting oxygen sensor And if it's way off on one side or way off on the other side, it's running too rich or too lean. And then there's a bunch of tools you adjusted the carburetor with, looking for vacuum leaks and all that kind of hogwash. Back in those days, they used to call fuel trim, short fuel trim, they called it integrator, and long fuel trim, they called it blockler, and this kind of thing. That's the first school I went to, though, in 1981 in Houston, Texas. Because I had a Delco parts supplier, they paid for me to go to that school, and so I went to that school. It was a 2-day school. The instructor was Ellen Smith. I think she still teaches somewhere. I hadn't seen her since then, but she was a really, really good instructor, really sharp, and I learned a heck of a lot. I learned stuff about open loop fuel control at that school that put me ahead of people that I worked with 5 or 6 years later that still didn't understand open and closed loop fuel control. But that's another story. This is my dad's Grand Marquis, and I was driving this thing. He's been in the hospital, and I've been driving 30 miles each way, and I'd take his car down there to keep it limbered up and all. And so I came back and I stopped at the drive-thru to get me a burger, and then I was going to pick my wife up something from the Chinese place. And when I was in the drive-thru at the Chinese place, I heard something pop, and then I smelled a little bit of coolant. I said, did I bust a hose or what? And I looked at the temperature gauge, and it wasn't going up yet. But I was hearing a noise too, a funny noise out there under the hood, a rattling noise or something. And so I went ahead and pulled around there and paid for the food and rushed on home with it because I wasn't all that far from home. Well, it started running bad, and the check engine light came on. And I'm thinking, well, I coasted as much as I could so I wouldn't make it any hotter than it already was. And whenever I said, well, I'll just go ahead and plug the scan tool into it, after I added a little coolant, but it wasn't that low. You might notice the codes I got here was I got a P1285, cylinder head temperature too high, it was obviously overheating, and it also had P1299, the cylinder head over temperature protection active. Now what it does on that's a Triton thing that they have on these pickups. You might see on the side of these F-150s where they have that Triton on their badge. And Triton, from what I was told by a Ford engineer one time, has to do with whenever it turns the fire off in other words, it stops putting fuel and fire in every other cylinder, and it uses those cylinders to pump air to cool the head, and then it changes cylinders, it swaps them back and forth. Now you're only running on 4 cylinders and you're losing power, but you can still get to where you're going. And usually these engines are not damaged by overheating like that. Now I'm not saying they can't be damaged, but they're less likely because of this Triton strategy that they use where it turns these cylinders off, But that's the code you get when it has had to do that, and that was on the car that I was driving. Now you can't hear the video here, but what you can see is you can see this fan. All right, I was looking at the cylinder head temperature wasn't that hot by that time, but I basically had it where, see that thing wiggling? That fan was just wobbling, And the reason it was wobbling was because the fan had cracked around its outer, that little rim around the outside, and because the fan had cracked, it was scrubbing on that shroud. That's what I was hearing sitting in the drive-thru. And it was actually heating the fan motor up, wasn't moving the air like it should, wasn't pulling enough air across the AC condenser in the radiator, and it just got hotter and hotter and hotter. And so I went to the Advanced Auto Parts and bought a $150 replacement fan assembly and popped it in there. It took about 10 minutes, and that's all that car needed. It was full of coolant and everything, but I was noticing when I was checking it that the radiator, there was no coolant on the ground anywhere under it. And the radiator hose, when I first parked it, was nice and turgid. It was really, so I said, it's holding a lot of pressure. If it was leaking anywhere, I'd be seeing coolant dripping out of it. And I wasn't going to take the fill cap off, with all that pressure in there for obvious reasons, because you get doused with that, it ruins your whole day. Well, that's all I got for you today. I'm going to move on now, and I'll go ahead and wait for your comments on this one. And thank you guys for watching my videos, and I'll see you next time.